In this tutorial, you will animate a construction to trace out the sine curve. First, you'll construct one point that moves along a circle and another point that moves along a segment. Then you'll construct a third point that connects the two motions. Next, you'll animate the construction and trace the intersection point. You'll adjust the segment so that point F traces only one curve. Finally, you'll connect your construction with the algebraic equation of a sine curve. I'll begin my investigation by constructing a point on a segment and another point on a circle. So first I'll choose the segment tool, and I'll construct a segment in my sketch. I'll hold down the Shift key to keep my segment horizontal. There. And I'll label the endpoints as A and B. Next I'm going to choose the compass tool and construct a circle with a radius point not on segment AB. And I'll label that point as C. And now I'll choose the point tool, and I'll construct a point on the circle that is not on the segment and is not the radius point. There. And I'll label that point as D. Now I'll go back to the segment tool, and I'll construct segment AD. And then I'll choose the marker tool, and I will construct the angle marker BAD by clicking on vertex A and then dragging into the angle. So now I'll choose the arrow tool, and I will just drag point D around the circle. And as I do, watch the angle marker. There, when I got past 180 degrees, it flipped. This is because, by default, the angle marker defines a simple angle that is always less than 180 degrees. But I'd like to change that because I want to see angle measurements for all 360 degrees of the angle. So I will click an empty space to deselect, and I will select just the angle marker, and I'll choose Edit, Properties. And I'll go to the marker panel, and I'll choose counterclockwise for angle definition. And I'll click OK. So now when I drag point D around the angle, I can get all angle values up to 360 degrees. So now I have my point on my circle, but I still need a point on my segment, so I'll choose the point tool again, and I'll construct a point on segment AB that is not on the circle. There. And I'll label that point as E. So I'll choose the arrow tool, and now I have a point that moves only on the segment, and a point that moves only on the circle, and I'd like to connect these two motions. So the way that I will do that is first I will construct a perpendicular line through point E. So I'll select point E and segment AB, and choose Construct Perpendicular Line. Now, I'd like to construct a line through point D that meets this line, and I'll do that by constructing a line parallel to AB that goes through point D. So I'll click an empty space, and I'll select the segment and point D, and choose Construct Parallel Line. And now I'll create the intersection by choosing the point tool, and waiting till both lines are highlighted and clicking. And this point I'll label as point F. So now I'm going to drag point D around the circle and watch what happens to point F as I do. And if I drag point E, what happens to point F? When I drag point D, point F seems to move just up and down along the line between the top of the circle and the bottom of the circle. And when I drag point E, point F just moves horizontally along in the same position. So we've seen what happens when we move just point E or just point D but I'd like to see what happens to point F when I move both points at the same time. So the way that I'll do that is that I'll select points E and D, and I'll choose Edit, Action Buttons, Animation. Now here, it says that point E will animate bidirectionally along, but I'd like to only animate it going forward, not forward and back. So I'll make sure that this row is highlighted, and I'll click bidirectional, and I'll choose forward. This way, the point will only animate in one direction. And I'll click OK. So now I get this button, and if I click the button, the 2 points move, and I can look at the path that point F is drawing out. If I press the button again, the animation stops, and I can maybe move any points that I like to move, and I can press the button again to start the animation, and press it again to stop. So now I've seen point F move along this path as I animate points D and E, but I'd like to trace out this path to see what shape it forms. So I'll select point F, and I'll choose Display, Trace Intersection. And now I'll click the Animate Points button again. And I'll look at the path traced out by point F. This is a very pretty path, but I'd like to find a way to make point F trace out just one curve over and over again, rather than all these different curves. So I'll stop the animation, and I'll choose Display, Erase Traces. So to make point F trace out just one curve, I need to change either the length of AB or the circumference of the circle. So you can experiment with changing either of these things. If you drag point B, remember to hold the Shift key down to keep it horizontal. And then animate points again to see how you're doing. Ooh. If you're having trouble making point F trace out just one curve, here I'll choose Display Erase Traces again. Then measure the length of segment AB by selecting it and choosing Measure Length. And then measure the circumference of the circle by selecting that and choosing Measure Circumference. And try working with these two measurements to see if you can't come up with something that works. So now, after you've found the measurements that work, erase the traces and trace out this path one more time. This path is called a sine curve, and as you can see, it traces the height of a point going around the circle as another point travels to the right. So now that I've looked at a model of how the sine curve works, I'd like to see how that relates to its equation on the coordinate plane. So I'm going to stop any motion that's happening, and I'll choose Display, Erase Traces, and I'll deselect everything, and then I'll select the circle, and I'll choose Graph, Define Unit Circle. Now notice what this does. It creates a coordinate system, and it places the center of my circle at the origin and gives my circle a radius of 1. So now I'd like to plot a point that is 2 pi out along the x-axis. So I'll deselect everything, and I'll choose Graph, Plot Points. So I want x-coordinate of 2 pi, and if I press P on my keyboard, that enters pi, and y-coordinate of 0, and I'll click Plot. And that's the only point I want, so I'll click Done. And see that that point is actually very close to point B, which means that I was very close in my approximation of the sine curve. But I'd like those points to actually be together, so I'll move them apart so that I can see them. And the point 2 pi 0 is selected, so I'll select point B, and I'll choose Edit, merge points. So now point B is defined to be at 2 pi 0. And I'll choose Graph, Grid Form, Trigonometric Axis. And Sketchpad asks if I'd like to switch my units from degrees to radians. And since we're graphing already in 2 pi, I think I will. So I'll say yes. And now it shows me the x-axis in units of pi. So I'd like to trace out my sine curve here on the coordinate plane. So I will drag point E over to 0. And I'll drag point D down to the x-axis. And I'll choose Display Erase Traces. And then I'll run my animation. And you might like to think about where this curve has its maximum and minimum, and where it is 0. And what does that mean in terms of the model that we built? So now I'll stop the animation again, and I'll choose Graph, Plot New Function, and I will type sine x, and I'll click OK. So now I see that my traces were just one period in a curve that goes on infinitely in either direction, repeating this period over and over again. So now, because the sine function is related to the position of point E and the measure of angle ABD, I'd like to measure those two things and see how they compare. So I will select the angle marker and choose Measure, Angle, and then I will select point E and choose Measure, Abscissa X. And I will drag the points back to the beginning of the curve, and I'll look at my animation again. And I'll see what relationships I notice between these two values.